Greetings. We're going to do Chapter 19, Transorganizational Change, as a next step to Monday's course, continuing on after Chapter 18. So transorganizational rationale really addresses the notion that allow organizations to perform tasks that are too costly and complicated for one organization to perform. So the notion here is that by partnering with one company and another that has different resources, different capabilities, will hopefully lead to a better outcome than they would independently have on their own. So their goods and services are changed between the organizations, and the transactions occur, and the strategies work best when the transactions are frequent and well understood. So for me, the notion of this, having that we have a few bankers in the group, I think about this as maybe a organizational collaboration related to credit card transactions from Visa and Bank of America, who is looking for some viable partner to help them with ATM cards and credit cards. And so those two unique capabilities are merged together in a trans-organizational approach to create a really good win-win. So within that system, the members maintain their separate organizational identities. Nobody changes the name of the company. They tend to be under-organized and are loosely coupled. So Visa can go off and continue to do its partnerships with others. Bank of America isn't limited in any other way as well. So they can go continue to do bank transactions with a myriad of different partners. And it is certainly different than mergers and acquisitions. You're not creating a new organization that is going to operate in perpetuity. And certainly network interventions may be appropriate in this scenario to bring about better understanding along the way. So the difference, the distinction is mergers and acquisitions are the integration. A merger is two previously independent companies create a new co or a new company. And that is very common. You see a lot of the companies that when you look at BB&T and SunTrust recently merged, and they created some strange name for the new organization or the new entity, but SunTrust and BB&T will cease to exist in their former brand, and they will create a new organization, and sometimes people will call that NewCo, as in new company. Whereas an acquisition is one person got eaten by the other. So when we talked about Bank of America in class and how they used to certainly have former organizations, First Nations, I believe. I always forget the names of all the companies that have been gobbled up by Bank of America. Merrill Lynch, even though it kept its own identity, I guess you could call that a bit more of a merger. But all the companies that make up the Bank of America umbrella were a result of acquisition. And then the distinct from trans-organizational systems, alliances and networks, they're different than alliances and networks because at least one of the organizations does cease to exist, as I mentioned. So why have a merger or an acquisition? So one of the compelling reasons is diversification. So in the instance of Bank of America, you can look at the Merrill Lynch transaction where they had great investment banking disciplines, and Bank of America didn't necessarily have that. And I think at the time, Ken Lewis really liked the idea of having Merrill Lynch under its flag because he felt like it gave them a bigger basket of things to trade with. And so that's one example of a much bigger conglomerate that has other functions and other organizations that have been part of it from a fintech standpoint and a technology standpoint, and other banks in different geographic regions that gave the bank a certain ability to gain market share and speak to different markets that they had not been in. So it was very strategic in that way. Vertical integration is a little bit different than diversification in the sense that vertical integration is just as it sounds. It means that you look at maybe a supply chain and you gobble up various companies that represent pieces and parts of that production. And so you may think of a organization that does copying and imaging like Xerox and Canon. Well, they both have a lot of the market share, but they both do very similar things with imaging and copying and cameras and whatnot. But if they were able to merge they would take that entire vertical market and create a much bigger market share of a company that would be able to capitalize on the fact that the two combined resources really create a bigger piece of the market share of imaging. And so that might be a good example of vertical integration where they do very similar things, but they merge together so that they can take up much more of the bandwidth or the market share in that area. So it also contributes to gaining access to global markets and technology and other resources. So there's certainly reasons why companies try to expand beyond the borders of their primary locations in their domestic market. And then they certainly may find some creative benefits by adopting new companies to help them with different technologies. I think you see this a lot with companies like Alphabet, who owns Google. You see this certainly with Amazon, where they've decided to get into the food grocery business so that they can continue to expand their market share through Amazon Prime. So I often call it Amazon Foods because to me that seems to be a really, really big pocket of the consumer market that they are going to capitalize on and probably have some really grand plans that we're not aware of, but it will certainly impact your experience at the grocery store and how you buy groceries in the future. And then achieving operational efficiencies, innovation, and resource sharing. For some companies, there's a real strategic reason to buy another company. Unfortunately, some of you have probably been either on the one end or the other of the downsizing or the right sizing of a company that got merged, and they no longer needed the duplication of the same resource, so somebody had to leave, or a department got summarily fired or furloughed because they were duplicating the same activity of the company that acquired them. And so those are ways to create value in a capitalistic approach. So those are some compelling reasons why you would do mergers and acquisitions. And then strategic alliances, I think about these in the sense of joint ventures, where you have two organizations that make an agreement for some determined period of time, typically not infinite, where they share resources, intellectual property, they combine their technologies and their people power for a particular goal. So this includes licensing agreements, franchises, long-term contracts. My most relevant experience in this in my career has been joint ventures, where you have maybe a firm that has a strategic relationship that you don't have, and you marry up with the other company, and you marry up with them because you have all of the physical assets and the processes and the market expertise to carry out that project. So you get together and do some sort of a split of the fees and the responsibilities, and you ordain that in some sort of a legal document that creates a new vehicle for just joint venturing. So I've done that a lot on multi-million-dollar buildings, and it's very common. But as you know, certainly licensing agreements and franchise agreements are very similar, where you're combining alliances, and your franchise is able to be a legal entity that can continue to scale by sharing the risk with other people who want to take on the responsibility for facilitating the corporate franchise and carry out that that branding across different markets and give it more reach. Network interventions are another approach to transorganizational change. This includes 3 or more companies getting together for a common purpose. They have goals related to how they're going to work together, focused on one's self-interest. And the book talks about this as being creating an initial network and managing change within an established network. So there's 2 types of approaches to doing that. So this is pretty darn common in the consulting space, where you may have a process consultant and they are really good at trying to figure out Six Sigma and how to help a company improve its productivity. And they need somebody that they can bolt onto that can be a strategic change agent and help them with the change management process, or the organizational development process, rather. And they're able to integrate in a way that makes them more effective at providing an entire solution for a company. You see this a lot in technology as well. So you may have somebody that's really good in cloud-based systems, and you may have somebody that's really good in hardware-based systems. And so they may come together, and then they may layer in someone else who is the process integrator that really writes all the standard operating procedures. And so, this gives you a little bit of a variety using some examples of how organizations do these types of, whether it's mergers and acquisitions, or creating transorganizational alliances or relationships, or working inside of a network. These are all viable approaches for you as a practitioner to help companies solve challenges that they're confronted with. So here's a little bit more about the application stage of transorganizational development. Hopefully this looks really familiar at this point in the semester, where you have identification, convention, organization, and evaluation. So this looks like who should belong to the organization, what are the skills and the knowledge, who are the key stakeholders, what are our agreements, should the organization be created, the costs and benefits, the tasks, the perceptions. This is almost like an analysis piece. This is kind of like contracting and entering. Then you have the organization about how we're going to go about doing things. How's the communication going to work? What's our leadership? How are the policies and procedures going to work? This is kind of the implementation phase. And then you have evaluation. How is it performing? What do we need to improve? This is our feedback phase. So it looks very similar to the general model of plan change, contracting and entering, doing the diagnosis and analysis, doing the implementation, and doing the feedback and follow-up. So hopefully this seems very familiar to you as a practitioner going forward about how we use the OD, the whole idea, the general model of plan change to inform all of the decisions that we make from an intervention standpoint. So this is another important piece of it, creating instability in the network. One of the things that the book talks about is the law of the few, and how do you manage the tipping point. And the law of the few is compelling because sometimes it takes just a few people, a few really influential people. So we've talked about power that can make a big difference with regard to making successful network outcomes. And so salespeople are the ambassadors. They're the ones that carry the mail every day, that make the pitch, that create the compelling purpose for why we're doing what we're doing. The mavens may be the people who are infinitely skilled and have strong expertise as subject matter experts that really bring the knowledge together, and they're essential to making the network effective and productive and perform well. And then the connectors are the ones who are really integrating all of the relationships. They're the ones creating the rapport, the trust within the network. And so the law of few is a really powerful concept, that it doesn't take an army of people to do this. Sometimes when you're kicking off a network arrangement or an agreement, it takes just a few who are able to wield and make influential decisions for getting everyone to buy in. The final thing I'll talk about related to this chapter is the notion of chaos theory. And chaos theory really lands nicely with the law of the few, in the sense that sometimes when you make a very small change within a network or an organization or within a system, the results may be very magnified. And so the small change results in something that really changes the course of the system. And so the one example that I can come up with off the top of my head is Steve Jobs. When he talked about when he was in college, he took a typeface course, and it really was the inspiration for how he created different fonts within the Apple computing system. And if you think about how that's really changed personal computing, it was a fundamental change that was one semester class that he took that was compelling, and it was one of the reasons and the motivators for why he wanted to make the Apple computer beautiful. And it really changed how we all visually see the display on a computer, and it's impacted us ever since he came up with that innovation. So I just kind of share that with you as an idea about how small changes can make a huge impact. And so we're going to wrap up on that chapter. I really did lie to you. It took much longer than I thought. Next time that we meet together, we'll talk about chapter 20 and 21, And we will also have the research paper due, and we'll do a final checkout as you get ready to move on to your next course within the program. And looking forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.